You're listening to the Bare Metal Cyber Prepcast, created to help you succeed in your PMP certification journey. Learn more at baremetalcyber.com, where additional prepcasts, books, and training materials await. Let's get started. Negotiation and influence are everyday realities for project managers. Success is rarely about winning an argument. It is about uncovering underlying interests, proposing creative options, and documenting agreements in a way that preserves trust. In this scenario lab, you will practice working through tough stakeholder situations where priorities collide, changes are requested, and influence dynamics come into play. The rule of thumb is simple. Don't escalate first. Begin with data, facilitate dialogue, and frame decisions around benefits, constraints, and documented options. PMI's expectation is that project managers act as facilitators who create clarity and alignment, not as referees who impose authority without process. Artifacts play a central role in disciplined negotiation. The benefits management plan and register show what outcomes matter most to the organization, helping stakeholders focus on value instead of personal preference. The constraints register or documented boundaries ensure that trade-offs are considered realistically, such as time, cost, or compliance obligations. The change path defines how requests flow through governance and when formal approvals are required. Finally, the decision log provides a durable record of what was agreed and why. Without these artifacts, negotiations drift into personalities and opinions. With them, discussions stay anchored in evidence and transparency. The first scenario involves conflicting priorities. Marketing wants feature A ready for an upcoming campaign. Operations, however, insist on prioritizing stabilization work to reduce the high defect rate. The constraints are clear. The launch date is fixed, capacity is limited, and reputational risk looms if defects continue. This is not a case of one side being right and the other wrong. Both demands reflect legitimate interests. The role of the project manager is to facilitate a decision that maximizes benefits, respects constraints, and avoids arbitrary compromises. Options in this scenario reveal different instincts. Option A suggests splitting capacity 50-50 without analysis. Option B recommends facilitating a structured trade-off session using benefits and risk data, then proposing a minimal viable version of feature A combined with stabilization work. Option C favors marketing outright, apologizing to operations. Option D proposes delaying the launch and escalating. At first glance, all might feel plausible, but only one reflects PMI's discipline of negotiation through evidence and integrative options. The correct choice is option B. By bringing stakeholders into a trade-off session, you align the conversation with documented benefits, risks, and capacity constraints. You create integrative options rather than zero-sum outcomes, such as delivering a minimal viable version of feature A while still allocating effort to stabilization. The decision is documented in the decision log and reflected in the roadmap. This preserves transparency and balance. Option A is arbitrary and may please no one. Option C and D ignore either risks or constraints, undermining trust. Option B is the professional facilitative path. Think about why arbitrary splits fail. Dividing resources equally may look fair, but it does not optimize value or reduce risk. It avoids conflict instead of resolving it. Favoring one side outright, as in option C, creates resentment and damages long-term cooperation. Delaying the launch without analysis, as in option D, ignores constraints and erodes credibility. The PMI lens guides you to analyze benefits, quantify risks, and create integrative solutions. That process transforms negotiation from a clash of personalities into a rational, evidence-based decision. Artifacts reinforce this process. The benefits register highlights the campaign value of feature A. The risk register quantifies reputational and operational risks of unresolved defects. The product roadmap shows dependencies and sequencing. Together, these artifacts provide the common language for negotiation. Documenting the outcome in the decision log ensures accountability. The rationale is visible and traceable. If questions arise later, you have evidence that the decision was not arbitrary but data-driven. PMI situational questions often test whether you choose to facilitate with data or cave to pressure. The professional answer is always data plus facilitation. This scenario also transfers easily to vendor-heavy projects. When vendors are involved, contract terms and service-level agreements must be part of the trade-off. For example, if stabilization work is tied to service levels in a contract, neglecting it could trigger penalties. Vendor capacity limits may also shape what can be negotiated. The lesson remains: use artifacts and evidence to frame options, not hierarchy or guesswork. PMI wants project managers to ensure fairness by treating all stakeholders, internal and external, with transparent processes. Pitfalls in stakeholder negotiation are predictable. Choosing based on seniority rather than data is a common trap. Skipping acceptance criteria clarity means that stakeholders may think they agreed on the same option but expect different outcomes. Failing to document the decision creates he said, she said disputes later. PMI situational stems often embed these pitfalls subtly, offering options like agree verbally and move forward. The disciplined project manager resists. Negotiation must end with documented agreements grounded in artifacts, not informal promises. The heuristic to carry forward is simple. Benefits plus constraints plus capacity create the option set. From that option set, you facilitate trade-offs, document the decision, and update artifacts. This heuristic ensures that you neither avoid conflict nor impose decisions. Instead, you frame the decision space, help stakeholders navigate it, and preserve transparency for governance. PMI's exam will reward answers that emphasize facilitation, data, and documentation. Negotiation is not about clever arguments. It is about systems that make decisions rational and defensible. The first scenario illustrates that negotiation is not about winning, but about integrating interests into a solution that respects constraints. PMI situational questions will often present you with competing stakeholder demands and tempt you with shortcuts like arbitrary splits, favoritism, or escalation. The professional answer is always to facilitate trade-offs with artifacts, propose integrative options, and document the outcome transparently. That is the path of ethical influence, where trust is built through fairness and process. At this point, you can see the rhythm of stakeholder negotiation. It begins with uncovering interests, flows into creating integrative options, and concludes with documentation. The project manager does not silence conflict, they harness it to create better outcomes. PMI's 4 values, responsibility, respect, fairness, and honesty, are visible here. Responsibility in owning the decision path. Respect in hearing all voices. Fairness in aligning with documented benefits and risks. Honesty in transparent communication. This is stakeholder influence in practice. For more cyber-related content and books, please check out cyberauthor.me. Also, there are other prepcasts on cybersecurity and more at baremetalcyber.com. The second scenario introduces a very common challenge. A high-influence stakeholder insists that a requested change is free. They argue it can be included without impact, and because of their authority, they expect it to move forward. The constraints are real, though. Interfaces ripple across systems, the testing window is already tight, and an audit is coming next month. Ignoring these constraints may create significant downstream risk. The artifacts that matter most here are the change log, the impact analysis template, and the governance thresholds that define when formal approval is required. These tools allow the project manager to shift the conversation away from personalities and back to process. The options in this case reflect pressure and pitfalls. Option A is to approve verbally to protect the relationship. Option B is to require an impact analysis, present options transparently, and decide via policy. Option C is to refuse outright and cite policy without offering alternatives. Option D is to add the change silently, hoping to reconcile later. PMI's expected answer is option B because it demonstrates responsibility, fairness, and honesty. Approving verbally undermines baselines and creates hidden risk. Refusing without analysis alienates the stakeholder and damages trust. Adding changes silently undermines traceability. Only option B blends respect with process. Analyze first, follow the governance path, and update artifacts. The artifacts reinforce this discipline. The change log records the request and its analysis. The impact analysis template shows how the request affects scope, schedule, cost, and risk. Governance thresholds determine whether backlog reprioritization is sufficient or if a formal change order is required. Once the decision is made, the decision log records the rationale. This paper trail transforms a high-pressure demand into a structured, defensible decision. PMI's exam often embeds this kind of scenario to see whether you will bend to authority or protect governance. The professional answer is always governance plus transparency. The third scenario takes us into vendor negotiation. A vendor requests schedule relief due to supply chain issues. You, however, need acceptance on time because penalties are looming and alternative suppliers are risky. This is a classic negotiation space where the concepts of BATNA and ZOPA come into play. BATNA best alternative to a negotiated agreement is your fallback if negotiation fails. ZOPA zone of possible agreement is the overlap between your needs and the vendors. Ethical and skilled project managers recognize that negotiation is not about threats. It is about exploring the space of possible agreements where both sides can succeed. The options reveal different instincts. Option A enforces penalties immediately, showing toughness but possibly harming collaboration. Option B explores options such as partial early delivery, splitting scope, or adjusting incentives with documentation in a formal amendment. Option C threatens termination without analysis, which escalates conflict. Option D ignores the issue and hopes recovery occurs, which is denial. PMI's answer is option B because it balances firmness with creativity. It recognizes constraints while seeking integrative solutions. Option A or C may be necessary if bad faith is proven, but in the exam context, exploring options with evidence and contract updates is always superior. Artifacts anchor this vendor negotiation. The contract type and incentive structure define what remedies or flexibilities exist. The statement of work shows the commitments in detail. The risk register highlights exposure if the delay continues. BATNA and ZOPA estimates give you negotiation clarity. What is your fallback if the vendor defaults, and where does common ground exist? Documenting any adjustments through amendments ensures that governance is preserved. This avoids the trap of informal deals that undermine fairness and create disputes. PMI's values show up here. Responsibility in owning the negotiation, fairness in honoring the process, honesty in documenting constraints, and respect in treating the vendor as a partner. It's important to note that vendor negotiations in an agile or predictive context both require formality. Some candidates mistakenly assume that agile procurement means handshake deals. PMI's exam will test whether you recognize that agile contracts still require amendments when thresholds are crossed. Even when backlog reprioritization handles small shifts, larger impacts must still flow through the contract file. The same principle applies here. Vendor delays must be addressed formally, with risks documented, incentives aligned, and amendments recorded. Ignoring the formal path is always a pitfall. Exam pitfalls in negotiation scenarios are designed to tempt you with quick fixes. One pitfall is approving changes or requests verbally without impact analysis. Another is ignoring governance because of stakeholder influence. A third is escalating prematurely without attempting negotiation. A fourth is blaming or threatening without offering integrative options. PMI expects you to recognize these traps and apply a structured heuristic. Uncover interests, analyze impacts, propose documented options, and decide via governance. This pattern is consistent across internal stakeholders and external vendors. Shortcuts may feel expedient, but erode trust and traceability. A helpful heuristic is to think in terms of sequence. Benefits and constraints define the space. Capacity sets the boundaries, and options are created within that zone. For vendors, BATNA and ZOPA frame negotiation. For internal stakeholders, benefits and risks drive trade-offs. In both cases, documentation is essential. Every option considered, every decision taken, and every trade-off agreed should be recorded in artifacts. PMI's exam will reward answers that reflect this rhythm: interest uncovered, impacts analyzed, governance respected, and records maintained. This transforms negotiation from personality-driven to evidence-driven. The closing reflection of this lab is that stakeholder negotiation and influence are not about power plays, but about ethical facilitation. The project manager's role is to hold the system steady under pressure, to remind stakeholders of benefits, risks, and constraints, to resist verbal shortcuts, to create integrative options, and to document outcomes transparently. Tools like BATNA and ZOPA help with vendors, while artifacts like the changelog, decision log, and benefits register help with internal stakeholders. PMI situational questions test whether you see negotiation as a structured process or a personality contest. The professional answer is always structure, evidence, and facilitation. Thanks for tuning in to the Bare Metal Cyber Prepcast, your trusted source for cybersecurity news and insights. Remember to subscribe at baremetalcyber.com so you never miss an update. And visit cyberauthor.me for best-selling cybersecurity books that equip you with expert knowledge. Until next time, stay secure and stay vigilant.